So I want you to just take a second and picture the classic, cinematic image of a resistance fighter.
Oh, right, yeah. The visual we've all been completely conditioned to recognize from the movies.
Exactly. It's that brave, ideologically pure peasant. They're wrapped up in these heavy winter coats, maybe clutching a bolt-action rifle.
With the bayonet attached, naturally.
Right. And they're leaping from the snowy, dense forest to sabotage this evil empire on literally day one of a brutal invasion.
And the dramatic music swells in the background.
Yes. The enemy train derails. It's just a very clean narrative. It's heroic, it's immediate, and it paints a picture of a unified people just spontaneously rising up against their oppressors the second enemy boots hit the ground.
It is an incredibly comforting narrative, honestly, and it's pretty easy to see why it became the dominant story.
Well, because it provides this clear-cut moral framework, right? Good versus evil.
Exactly. After a cataclysmic event like the Second World War, nations desperately need those foundational myths. They need them to process the trauma and build a cohesive national identity.
Which makes sense.
Right, and the Soviet Union built an entire post-war cultural industry on that exact image.
Right.
The spontaneous all-people's uprising.
But in this deep dive, we are going to completely shatter that cinematic image.
Oh, absolutely.
We're exploring the gritty, heavily mythologized, and often just terrifying reality of the Soviet partisan war against the German Army Group North.
And we are drawing our insights today from Alexander Hill's meticulously researched book, The War Behind the Eastern Front, the Soviet partisan movement in Northwest Russia, 1941 to 1944.
So the mission for this deep dive is to trace the complete, unvarnished evolution of this movement for you.
From its disastrous near annihilation in the summer of 1941.
Yeah, through an agonizing, incredibly bloody period of professionalization in 1942 and 1943.
All the way to its massive, pragmatic explosion in 1944.
Now, I should mention right up front, we are going to be talking about some highly charged political history here involving both Soviet and German state actions.
Right, and to be clear, we are not taking any ideological sides or endorsing any of the brutal actions described in these sources.
No, definitely not. We are simply unpacking the historical reality as it was recorded in the archives to help you understand what actually happened on the ground.
And the value of Alexander Hill's work really lies in that source material. For decades, the history of this shadow war was completely obscured by the propaganda we just mentioned.
The official state history claimed this, what was the word? Visenarodno.
Visenarodno, yes. And all people struggle from the very beginning.
But Hill's work dives into the newly opened Soviet archival sources, right?
He does. We are looking at the internal files of the central headquarters of the partisan movement.
Yeah.
The raw, unfiltered reports from commanders who were literally freezing in the woods.
Wow.
And he puts those right alongside German military records that were captured and held in the U.S. National Archives.
So you get both sides of the story.
Exactly. Comparing the internal Soviet reports directly with the internal German reports allows us to piece together the actual mechanics of what happened in those forests, stripped of all the romance.
I am really looking forward to unpacking this because we're looking at history not as a propaganda poster, but as a deeply complex web of raw survival, cutthroat bureaucracy, and just brutal military realities.
It really is a fascinating web.
So to fully grasp the sheer scale of what we are talking about, we have to set the stage for you. Where exactly is this drama unfolding?
We are focusing on Northwest Russia, specifically the Leningrad and Kalinin oblasts.
Okay, so when the German Army Group North invaded in 1941, this was the vast area they occupied on their drive toward Leningrad.
Correct. Geographically, we are talking about roughly 80,000 square kilometers of territory.
That is massive.
It is incredibly inhospitable terrain for a mechanized army, but theoretically, it's perfect for guerrilla warfare.
Because of the forests, right?
Yes, it's heavily forested, dominated by deep taiga, massive swamps, terrible road networks, and a famously harsh climate.
But beyond the physical geography, the historical and demographic makeup of this specific area is the really crucial element for our deep dive, isn't it?
It absolutely is. This region had a largely ethnically homogeneous Russian population.
I want to pause on that demographic point for a second. If we're trying to understand the broad strokes of the Eastern Front, why does that specific detail, a homogeneous Russian population, change the way we should look at the partisan movement here?
Because it strips away a massive layer of historical noise.
How so?
Well, in other parts of the Soviet Union, the dynamics of occupation and resistance were hopelessly tangled with other complex historical forces.
Like in Belarus or Ukraine?
Exactly. In places like Belarus or parts of Ukraine, German occupation policies were heavily intertwined with the Holocaust. The systematic extermination of large Jewish populations fundamentally altered the nature of who fled to the woods and why.
Right, that makes sense. It completely changes the motivation.
Furthermore, in Ukraine or the Baltic states, you had deep-seated ethnic nationalisms. You had local populations who initially viewed the Germans as liberators from Soviet oppression.
Oh, wow, so they were actually welcoming them at first.
Many did, yes. And that led to these complex, three-way civil wars between German occupiers, Soviet partisans, and nationalist militias.
So in those areas, a local peasant might be fighting the Germans, but they might also be fighting the Soviets, or they might even be fighting their neighbors based on ethnic lines. It's just a chaotic web of motivations.
Precisely. It is the opposite of a clean laboratory for historical study.
Hmm.
But in northwest Russia, the Kaliningrad and Leningrad regions, there were very few Jewish communities, and the population was overwhelmingly ethnically Russian.
So no widespread separatist movements.
None. There was no organized movement hoping to build an independent state with German help. So by isolating our focus here, we remove those compounding variables.
We're basically looking at a closed system.
Exactly. What we are observing is the direct, unadulterated relationship between a homogeneous population, the German forces of occupation, and the representatives of Soviet power trying to organize a resistance.
It lets us see exactly how and why ordinary people, stripped of those nationalist variables, make the choice to fight, to collaborate, or to simply try and survive a cataclysm.
It really does.
That framing completely changes how I view the timeline. So let's jump into the timeline itself. June 1941, Operation Barbarossa begins.
The German war machine smashes across the border into the Soviet Union.
Now, if I look at the broad sweep of Russian history, I immediately think of irregular warfare. I think of the famous 1812 defense, where irregulars harassed Napoleon's Grand Army all the way back to Paris.
A classic example.
Right, and I think of the massive partisan bands of the Russian Civil War that helped cement Bolshevik power.
Also true.
So given that deep historical playbook, I would assume the Soviets in 1941 were absolute masters of guerrilla combat. Like, they should be sitting in the woods ready to spring the ultimate trap on the Germans.
Your assumption aligns perfectly with the military logic of the 1920s.
Okay, so they were preparing for it.
Oh, extensively.
Yeah.
Following the Russian Civil War, leading Soviet military thinkers, most notably Mikhail Frunze, strongly emphasized preparing for partisan warfare in the event of a foreign invasion.
Because they knew they were surrounded by enemies.
Exactly. The early Soviet state recognized that they were surrounded by hostile capitalist powers, and they actively prepared a defense-in-depth strategy.
So what did that actually look like on the ground?
Throughout the 1920s and into the early 1930s, the Red Army actually selected specific cadres to lead partisan detachments. They set up specialized, highly secretive training schools.
Like commando schools.
Essentially, yes. Training for demolition, wilderness survival, and clandestine communication. They even established extensive secret supply caches in a belt up to 100 kilometers wide along the entire western border.
Wait, really? They literally buried supplies?
They buried weapons, explosives, gold for bribing locals, and even underground printing presses. They were preparing exactly the kind of sophisticated, pre-planned trap you are imagining.
But the archives from 1941 show the exact opposite of a sophisticated trap. They show a Soviet defense that is woefully, almost comically unprepared for any kind of fighting behind enemy lines.
It was a total disaster.
So I'm trying to bridge the gap here. If they literally built secret bunkers full of weapons and trained elite cadres in the 1920s, how did they suddenly forget their own doctrine by 1941? What happened to the playbook?
The playbook was deemed politically radioactive by Joseph Stalin.
Radioactive.
Yes. To understand this catastrophic failure, we have to look at the intersection of Soviet military doctrine and Stalin's extreme institutionalized paranoia in the late 1930s.
Ah, the purges.
Right. As Stalin consolidated total power, the military doctrine of the Soviet Union shifted to become strictly, aggressively offensive.
Meaning they only planned to attack.
It's exactly. The official, unassailable party line dictated that any future war would be fought entirely on enemy territory. The Red Army would absorb an initial blow, immediately counterattack, and carry the proletarian revolution into the aggressor's homeland with very little loss of Soviet blood.
So in that political climate, preparing to fight a guerrilla war behind your own lines implies that you expect your own lines to collapse.
It implies the enemy will conquer Soviet territory, which was an unacceptable thought.
And under Stalin, implying that the Red Army might fail was not just viewed as pessimistic. It was viewed as defeatist, counter-revolutionary, and deeply treasonous.
Precisely. The mere existence of those partisan preparations became a political liability. Consequently, the entire apparatus built in the 1920s was actively, systematically dismantled by the Soviet state itself.
They destroyed their own bunkers.
The secret caches of weapons were dug up and liquidated. The underground printing presses were destroyed. But the physical destruction of the infrastructure was only half the tragedy.
What was the other half?
During the Great Purges of 1937 and 1938, the NKVD, the Internal Secret Police, targeted the military and intelligence apparatus. The guerrilla warfare experts, the veterans of the Civil War, the people who actually understood the mechanics of clandestine resistance.
Let me guess. They were arrested.
Arrested, interrogated, and executed as enemies of the people.
So they executed their own experts because knowing how to fight a defensive war made them suspicious.
It is a staggering self-inflicted wound.
I mean, that is just completely wild.
When the Germans actually did invade in June 1941, and the front lines collapsed exactly as those purged experts had feared decades earlier, the institutional memory and the physical infrastructure for a partisan war had been utterly wiped out.
The Soviet leadership was completely blind.
Blind and reacting in pure panic.
Which explains the absolute chaos of that first summer. The German armored spearheads are driving hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. The Soviet leadership in Moscow realizes they have no underground network, so they start issuing these frantic decrees.
Very frantic.
By late June and July of 1941, they are ordering local Communist Party officials to form destruction battalions and partisan detachments to fight in the enemy rear.
Right.
But the people they are ordering to do this, they aren't trained commandos. They aren't the guys from the 1920s demolition schools. Who exactly is being told to go into the woods?
These early detachments were haphazardly thrown together and led by the only reliable state representatives left in the path of the German advance. Local civilian bureaucrats.
Oh.
We were talking about district party secretaries, municipal administrators, and the heads of local NKVD troikas.
Okay, I want to dig into that term, an NKVD troika. For an audience that might not be steeped in the bureaucratic terror of the Soviet system, what is a troika and why is it significant that these specific men were suddenly put in charge of guerrilla warfare?
So an NKVD troika was essentially a three-man extrajudicial commission. It typically consisted of the regional NKVD chief, the local party secretary, and the state prosecutor.
Yep.
During the purges of the late 1930s, these troikas were given sweeping, terrifying powers. They could arrest, try, sentence, and execute Soviet citizens in a matter of minutes, entirely outside the formal legal system.
That is terrifying.
They were the ultimate instruments of state terror at the local level. They were men used to sitting behind desks, signing execution warrants for unarmed civilians, and operating with absolute, unquestioned authority in an environment of total control.
And suddenly the war flips the script on them. You have these terrifying, desk-bound bureaucrats who are used to absolute power, and Moscow orders them to grab whatever rusty rifles they can find, run into a freezing swamp, and fight the most professional, heavily mechanized army the world had ever seen.
The absurdity of the situation cannot be overstated.
It sounds like a dark comedy.
It really does. They were given a mandate from Moscow to destroy bridges, cut communication lines, and create intolerable conditions for the German army. But they had absolutely no military training.
Not at all.
None. They had no understanding of small unit tactics, camouflage, or reconnaissance. More importantly, they lacked basic wilderness survival skills. You cannot simply decree a guerrilla force into existence.
I'm imagining guys in business suits trying to camp in the snow.
That's not far off. These destruction battalions went into the woods with whatever food they could carry in their pockets, wearing civilian shoes, and armed with a mismatched collection of hunting rifles, old revolvers, and perhaps a few surplus grenades.
The archives paint a miserable picture of this. These amateur partisans were absolutely decimated, and not always by the Germans. Many of these units dissolved before they even heard a gunshot.
Decimation is the only word for it. The sheer terror of the German advance, combined with the realization that they were entirely unequipped for survival, caused massive desertions.
Do we have specific examples of that?
We do. The archives reveal instances like the Karmashevsky district, where the local destruction battalion disbanded almost immediately. Because their commander, the chairman of the local executive committee, simply abandoned them and fled east to save himself when he heard the German tanks were approaching. The leadership structure just evaporated.
Yeah. Every man for himself.
Exactly. For those who did follow orders and made it into the dense forests of the Kalinin and Leningrad oblasts, the reality of the situation was bleak.
So they are sitting in the woods, starving, waiting to ambush a German convoy. But the Germans aren't just sending regular infantry into the rear. They have specific units designed to crush exactly this kind of amateur resistance.
Oh, the German military apparatus was incredibly systematic.
Yeah.
They deployed dedicated security divisions, like the 281st Security Division, to sweep the rear areas.
And their only job was hunting partisans.
These units were tasked specifically with pacification and anti-partisan operations. They would move through the forests with dogs, overwhelming firepower, and a mandate for utter ruthlessness. The amateur Soviet detachments were hunted down like animals.
That's brutal.
By the time the brutal Russian winter set in, around December 1941, the numbers recorded in the Soviet archives are shockingly low. Across the vast expanse of the Kalinin and Leningrad regions, an area larger than many European countries, there were only about 4,000 active partisans remaining.
4,000 for that huge area.
Yes. In the Kalinin Oblast specifically, the Soviet command tracked 73 separate detachments. By the end of the year, the average size of those detachments had plummeted to just 20 to 40 starving, freezing men.
A microscopic force. 20 men huddled around a smokeless fire in a frozen swamp, completely isolated.
It was desperate.
And this brings us to the part of the history that really shatters the post-war myth. The cinematic narrative insists that the moment these brave party officials went into the woods, the local peasants rose up to support them.
The myth of the loyal villagers.
Right. The myth says the villagers baked them bread, hid them in their barns, and provided intelligence on German movements.
Yeah.
But what do the actual internal reports say about the civilian reaction in 1941?
The internal partisan reports, the desperate messages sent back to the Soviet lines, paint a picture of profound isolation and civilian hostility.
Hostility, not just neutrality.
Often active hostility. The local population did not rise up to support them. In the overwhelming majority of cases, the peasants tried to remain strictly neutral. To understand this, we have to look at the situation through the eyes of a farmer in the Leningrad Oblast in the autumn of 1941.
Okay, put us in their shoes.
First, there is the sheer visceral terror of German reprisals.
Yeah.
The German security divisions did not just hunt the partisans, they implemented a calculated policy of collective punishment.
Meaning, if you help a partisan, your whole family pays.
Exactly. If a German patrol found a footprint leading from a forest into a village, or if they suspected a farmer of giving a partisan a piece of bread, the consequences were apocalyptic. Entire families were executed, homes were burned to the ground, and sometimes the entire village was liquidated as a warning.
So from the peasant's perspective, the partisan isn't a hero. The partisan is a walking death sentence for their entire family.
Exactly. And the second factor is the geopolitical reality of 1941. In those early months, the German advance seemed entirely unstoppable.
Right, they were at the gates of Moscow.
They had destroyed entire Soviet armies, taken millions of prisoners, and were besieging Leningrad. Many civilians living under occupation reasonably believed that the Soviet Union was finished. The communist system was gone, and the German occupation was permanent.
I mean, if you believe your old government is dead forever, and the new military government will literally burn your children alive if you help a starving, desperate local party official hiding in the woods, no rational human being is going to help that official.
No, they aren't.
The pragmatism of basic survival completely overrides any ideological loyalty to a state that seems to have collapsed.
This pragmatism manifested in ways that Soviet propagandists later had to completely erase from the history books.
What kind of things did they erase?
We see archival reports from partisan commanders complaining bitterly, not just about a lack of help, but about active hostility. In the Lukyansky district, a partisan commander reported that when his men approached a village looking for food, the locals fled into the woods to escape them.
To escape the partisans?
Yes. The mere presence of the partisans was viewed as a localized plague that would attract German fire. Furthermore, the archives show that local civilians and newly formed local collaborative police units actively hunted down these isolated partisans.
Wait, the locals hunted them down?
They tracked them through the snow and turned them over to the German security forces. The partisan movement in 1941 was not a glorious uprising. It was an isolated, starving remnant, largely viewed as a dangerous nuisance by the very population it claimed to be defending.
That is a staggering realization. You cannot fight a heavily mechanized German army group with a handful of starving, incompetent party secretaries who are actively being hunted by their own neighbors.
You really can't.
This absolute, undeniable failure in 1941 forced Moscow into a corner. They realized they couldn't just issue a decree and wish a popular uprising into existence. If they wanted a war in the German rear, they needed to build a professional military machine from scratch.
And that transition out of this disaster introduces us to the massive bureaucratic and military overhaul of 1942 and 1943.
So how did they start fixing it?
The Soviet High Command recognized that the amateur approach was resulting in the slow annihilation of their personnel behind enemy lines. The survivors in the woods needed professionalization, central control, rigorous training, and above all, specialized logistics.
Makes sense.
So, on May 30th, 1942, the State Defense Committee, the highest wartime authority in the Soviet Union, officially established the central headquarters of the partisan movement, commonly referred to by its acronym TSSHPD.
TSSHPD, got it.
The goal was to take overall responsibility for the partisan war across the entire Soviet Union and centralized command. To lead this massive new endeavor, Stalin appointed a man named Panteleimon Ponomarenko.
And this is where the history transitions from a story of freezing in the woods to a story of cutthroat, high-level political survival.
Oh, the politics were vicious.
Because creating a new, powerful military branch in the middle of a totalitarian state fighting for its life is never a simple administrative task. Ponomarenko doesn't just get to sit at a desk and start organizing airdrops. He steps into a massive, incredibly dangerous turf war.
A very dangerous turf war.
Who is he fighting against?
He is stepping into a bureaucratic battleground with some of the most dangerous men in the Soviet Union. Before the central headquarters was formed, there was no unified command. The Communist Party apparatus, the regular Red Army Intelligence Directorate, and the NKVD were all independently trying to run their own partisan units.
So they were all competing.
They were hoarding resources, refusing to share intelligence, and actively competing with each other for influence in Stalin's favor. And the most formidable obstacle Ponomarenko faced was Lavrentiy Beria, the head of the NKVD.
We need to underline who Lavrentiy Beria is for you listening. He isn't just a cabinet minister. He is the architect of state terror.
Absolutely.
He runs the gulags, he runs the secret police, and crossing him usually means a bullet to the back of the head. Why does Beria care about the partisans?
Beria viewed the partisan movement as an internal security and intelligence asset that rightfully belonged entirely under his purview. The NKVD's specialty was espionage, sabotage, and maintaining political control over the population. Beria wanted the partisans to function as specialized sabotage squads and intelligence gatherers for the secret police.
But Ponomarenko wanted something different.
Ponomarenko had a fundamentally different vision. He wanted to build a cohesive, large-scale military structure that could integrate operationally with the regular Red Army. He wanted regiments and brigades capable of holding territory and launching coordinated strikes against German logistics, not just isolated spies in the woods.
It's a massive clash of visions. Beria wants elite, shadowy saboteurs controlled by the police. Ponomarenko wants a shadow army controlled by the military. And because Stalin's managerial style was basically to pit his subordinates against each other to prevent anyone from getting too powerful, this tension results in some incredibly bizarre administrative whiplash that directly affects the men freezing in the forests.
The bureaucratic sabotage was relentless. Ponomarenko later claimed in his memoirs that Stalin had actually approached him to set up this centralized headquarters back in November of 1941. The plans were drawn up, the orders were ready, and then at the very last second, the initiative was mysteriously pulled.
I wonder who did that.
Well, Ponomarenko strongly suspected that Beria had intervened directly with Stalin to kill the project and protect his turf. Even after Ponomarenko finally succeeded in getting the TSSHPD established in May 1942, the toggling of command did not stop.
They kept fighting over it.
The bureaucratic warfare reached a peak in March 1943. When the central headquarters was suddenly, without warning, disbanded entirely.
Wait, they disbanded the central command of the partisan movement in the middle of the war?
They did. The official, publicly stated excuse was that the headquarters had fulfilled its role and that command should be decentralized back to the regional fronts.
But no one actually believes that.
No. Historians looking at the archives widely view this as the direct result of Beria's ongoing, relentless attempts to dismantle a rival power base. However, the realities of the war intervened. The decentralization caused immediate logistical chaos, and just a month later, in April 1943, The central headquarters was hurriedly reestablished.
That is just wild. This high-level political soap opera, the memos, the backstabbing, the sudden shifts in command that had life-or-death consequences for the partisans. A delayed order or canceled supply flight because of a turf war in Moscow meant starvation for a unit in the Kalinin Oblast.
It absolutely did.
But despite this terrifying political drama playing out in the halls of the Kremlin, the creation of the central headquarters did fundamentally change the reality on the ground. The Red Army began exerting massive influence over the partisan structure.
Yes, the military is over. We stopped seeing the amateur middle management bureaucrats running the show, and we start seeing the implementation of real military logistics. How did the partisan movement actually come of age during this period?
The transformation was driven by technology and training. The partisan movement was finally being integrated into the broader strategic Soviet war effort. The central headquarters began flying in highly trained specialist cadres to replace or augment the surviving local leadership.
So actual military guys.
Right. They established training camps on the Soviet side of the lines to teach demolition, marksmanship, and encrypted communication. They began supplying the partisans with proper, reliable small arms, standardized explosives like TNT blocks with proper fuses, and submachine guns, which were devastating in close-quarters forest ambushes.
That's a huge upgrade from rusty hunting rifles.
A massive upgrade. But the single most transformative piece of technology introduced to the forests was the radio.
I imagine having a radio fundamentally changes you from a group of lost men in the woods into an actual arm of the military. Where were they getting these radios? The logistics of communication were vital. The Soviets developed specialized lightweight radios, like the Severset, which could be carried in a backpack and powered by hand-cranked generators.
Hand-cranked? Wow.
Crucially, many of the high-quality components, and particularly the long-lasting batteries required to operate in the freezing cold, were actually supplied via Lend-Lease from the Western Allies.
Oh, that's a fascinating detail.
The introduction of reliable two-way radio communication changed everything. It allowed the Central Command in Moscow to coordinate simultaneous attacks across hundreds of miles of territory. It allowed the partisans to transmit vital reconnaissance regarding German troop movements back to the Red Army.
So they're actually acting as forward observers.
Exactly. And perhaps most significantly for the morale of the fighters, it allowed them to arrange for aircraft.
The psychological impact of aircraft cannot be overstated. Earlier in 1941, if you were a partisan and you caught a stray bullet in the leg during a skirmish, your war was over. You died slowly of infection or exposure in the swamp, or you shot yourself so the Germans wouldn't torture you.
It was a grim reality.
But the radio changes that brutal math.
It alters the entire psychological landscape of the fighter. With radios, partisan units could coordinate with the Soviet Air Force. They would find a frozen lake deep in the forest, mark out a makeshift runway with burning pine branches in the dead of night, and radio for a pickup.
Like a secret midnight flight.
Exactly. Small, rugged aircraft like the Polikarpov U-2 biplane could fly low under German radar, land on the ice, drop off crates of ammunition and medical supplies, and evacuate the seriously wounded back to hospitals on the Soviet mainland.
The knowledge that a plane might actually come for you if you were bleeding completely transformed the fighting spirit of the detachments.
It absolutely did. It gave them hope.
And with this new professionalization, this new umbilical cord to the mainland, came a total shift in how they fought the war. The Red Army Command realized that the tactics of 1941, throwing 100 lightly armed partisans at a heavily fortified concrete railway bridge guarded by German heavy machine guns and spotlights, was a fantastic way to get 100 partisans killed for zero strategic gain.
A completely useless sacrifice.
They needed a smarter approach. That realization leads to a massive tactical shift in July 1943. The Central Headquarters issues a new directive. They call it the War of the Rails.
The War of the Rails.
What was the mechanical logic behind this order?
The logic was brutal, mathematical, and brilliant. The German military machine on the Eastern Front relied entirely on the railway network to supply its massive armies. Millions of tons of ammunition, fuel, and food had to move across a vast hostile landscape.
So you attack the supply lines.
Right. But the initial partisan instinct was to attack the choke points, the major bridges. But a bridge is a single, high-value target. The Germans understood this, and they easily fortified them. They built concrete pillboxes, cleared the forests around the bridges to create overlapping fields of fire, and stationed elite troops there. A lightly armed partisan unit attacking a bridge was committing suicide.
So what's the alternative?
Well, a railway line stretches for hundreds and hundreds of miles, through empty, dense forests.
Ah, so the structure of a railway is its own vulnerability.
Precisely. The July 1943 order directed the partisans to stop wasting lives on heavily defended bridges and instead focus their explosives on the tracks themselves. The directive ordered them to blow up thousands and thousands of individual steel rails simultaneously across the entire occupied territory.
Because you can't guard all of it.
Exactly. The Germans simply did not have the manpower to place a guard every 50 yards along a 500-mile stretch of track in the dark.
Think about this mechanically. It is like a virus attacking a nervous system. If you try to chop off the head of the enemy by taking out a massive bridge, the body fights back with everything it has. But if you inject a virus that just severs all the millions of little nerve endings, the individual tracks the body, becomes paralyzed.
That's a great analogy.
A partisan doesn't need to fight a pitched battle. They just need to creep up to an unguarded stretch of rail at 2 a.m., clamp a small block of TNT to the steel, set a simple chemical fuse, and melt back into the trees.
That distributed disruption caused massive logistical hemorrhage for the German army. Trains derailed, schedules were completely ruined, and massive backlogs of supplies piled up at marshalling yards, which then became lucrative targets for the regular Soviet bomber wings.
It's a cascading effect.
It was. The Germans were forced into frantic countermeasures. They started forcing local civilians to cut down trees up to 100 meters on either side of the tracks to deny the partisans cover.
Yeah.
They built armored trains to patrol the lines.
But did it work?
Not really. The sheer volume of attacks, thousands of rails blown in a single night, overwhelmed their security apparatus. It was a highly effective, deeply professional tactical shift that maximized the partisans' advantages of stealth and mobility.
It sounds like the movement has finally figured it out. They have radios, they have airplanes, they have a brilliant new strategy, and they are bleeding the German logistics dry.
On paper, yes.
But we have to introduce a massive, tragic caveat here. Just because the partisans were now a formalized, better-equipped military branch running this highly organized war of the rails, it absolutely did not mean they were safe, and it did not mean they were winning the war in the rear.
No, far from it.
In fact, this newfound organization made them the target of some of the most horrific violence of the war.
This is the tragic paradox of the partisan movement's middle phase, what we might call its adolescence. In 1942 and much of 1943, as the movement became stronger and better equipped, the Soviet command increasingly ordered them to mass into larger formations.
Why would they do that?
The logic was that a brigade of 1,000 men could hold territory, establish permanent camps, and launch larger operations. But the moment they massed together, they lost their only true defense.
Their invisibility.
Exactly. A group of 20 men can hide in a swamp. A brigade of 2,000 men requires massive encampments, huge supply drops, and leaves a footprint that the Germans could easily spot from the air or through informant networks.
And when the Germans spot a target that big, they don't send the local police. They drop the hammer.
The German response was terrifying in its scale. While the routine rear area security troops were often older, second-line soldiers, when a major partisan threat emerged, when a partisan zone was established, the German High Command would authorize major pacification sweeps.
Meaning they brought in the heavy hitters.
They would pull regular, highly lethal combat divisions off the front line, units equipped with armor, heavy artillery, and combat aviation, and send them into the rear to hunt the partisans.
The destruction of the Leningrad partisan zone in the late summer of 1942 is the textbook example of how badly this could end. The partisans had achieved something incredible. They had actually carved out a massive safe zone, a chunk of territory deep behind German lines, where they essentially functioned as the government.
They did. They felt confident. They felt like an army.
But then the main front line stabilized, the German advance halted, and the Wehrmacht had the breathing room to turn its attention backwards.
And the force they brought to bear against that zone was overwhelming and systematic. To crush the Leningrad partisan zone, the Germans pulled in the 218th Infantry Division and elements of the 8th Panzer Division.
Oh man, panzer divisions against guys in the woods.
We are talking about frontline, battle-hardened troops who had been fighting the Red Army. They brought tanks, heavy mortars, and thousands of men, outnumbering the partisans in the zone by at least 3 to 1. The operation began in early August 1942.
How did the Germans approach it?
They used standard military tactics, encirclement, artillery barrages, and slow, methodical infantry advances through the forests. Tragically, the Central Command in Moscow, still thinking in terms of conventional warfare, ordered the partisans to hold their ground and defend the territory.
Which is madness. You cannot order guys with submachine guns and rifles to hold a static trench line against panzer divisions.
It was a disastrous mistake. They were simply no match for regular mechanized formations in a pitched battle. By early September, the entire partisan zone was systematically reduced and completely crushed. The casualty rates were horrific, and the surviving partisans were scattered back into tiny, desperate bands.
And this wasn't an isolated incident. The archives are full of these massive German sweeps. Let's look closely at another one detailed in the sources. Operation Spring Clean, which took place in April 1943 down near a place called Kudover.
Operation Spring Clean was brutal.
The mechanics of this operation showed just how desperate the situation was for the fighters on the ground. The partisans are pushed into a densely wooded area, and suddenly they realize they're surrounded by a tightening noose of 4,000 to 5,000 regular German troops.
The German tactics in these sweeps were designed to create an inescapable net. They would form massive cordons, utilizing troops, tracking dogs, and local collaborators who knew the terrain. They would slowly walk inward, shrinking the perimeter, sweeping every ravine and swamp.
Like shooting fish in a barrel.
Exactly. The archival reports from the partisan commanders who survived Operation Spring Clean describe a desperate, fragmented nightmare. The partisans quickly ran out of ammunition trying to hold a perimeter. As the German artillery began pounding the woods, the partisan command realized that holding together as a large brigade was suicide.
So they have to break the fundamental rule of a military unit. They have to dissolve.
They had to order a breakout. But you cannot march 1,000 men through a German cordon. They had to break down into tiny groups of 5 or 10 men and attempt to filter through the German lines in the dead of night, crawling through the mud, hoping the sentries wouldn't spot them.
The panic must have been unbelievable.
The physical and moral cost of this breakout was terrible. The partisans relied on horses for their entire logistical train, moving supplies, radios, and heavy equipment. During Operation Spring Clean, they had to abandon roughly 1,500 horses to the Germans or shoot them to prevent capture.
That's a massive loss of logistics.
It was. But the most agonizing detail in the reports concerns the wounded.
Yeah, I mean, if you are running through a swamp in the dark trying to slip past a German machine gun post, you cannot carry a man on a stretcher.
You cannot. The commanders reported that they had to leave behind more than 100 seriously wounded partisans. They hid them in ravines or thick brush, hoping the Germans would miss them. But everyone knew what that meant. If the German sweep found them, they would be executed immediately.
That is just gut-wrenching.
Many of the partisans who did manage to escape the tightening net were completely broken. They were forced to make unauthorized, desperate retreats, navigating hundreds of miles back through the main front lines to reach Soviet territory, what they called the Bolshaya Zemlya, the Big Land.
I read a detail from the commander's after-action reports that really stuck with me. They noted that during the heaviest artillery fire, when the German cordons were closing in, a significant number of the local recruits, the guys who had joined from the nearby villages, just broke.
They just gave up.
Yeah, they threw their rifles into the bushes, buried their partisan armbands, and melted back into the civilian population, hoping to sneak back to their farms and pretend they had never left.
It's pure survival instinct.
It forces a difficult question about the reality of the war. If I am looking at the mechanics of this middle period, if the partisans group up, they get crushed by panzer divisions and lose all their wounded. If they split up into tiny bands, they freeze or starve in the woods and can't achieve their military objectives. Mathematically, this movement should have been annihilated. How did they actually survive 1942 and 1943 without just giving up entirely?
It is the ultimate paradox of asymmetric warfare on the Eastern Front. Their survival was not necessarily due to their own tactical brilliance, but rather largely due to two massive factors outside of their direct control.
What were they?
First, the sheer unimaginable vastness of the Russian terrain. The forests, the deep taiga, and the impassable swamps provide an infinite number of hiding places. A modern army can sweep a forest, but it cannot occupy a swamp indefinitely.
Okay, that makes sense.
The second, and far more critical factor, was the constant, grinding, horrific pressure of the regular Red Army fighting at the main front line.
So the Germans are fighting a two-front war, but one front is in their own backyard.
Exactly. The German High Command simply could not afford the luxury of keeping panzer divisions and elite infantry in the rear hunting partisans for very long. Whenever the Red Army launched a major offensive, The German command would frantically siphon those combat troops back out of the forests and rush them to the front to plug the holes in their line.
So it becomes a grim, predictable cycle. The Germans launch a massive sweep, they scatter the partisans, they burn a few villages, they claim a decisive victory in their reports, and then 3 weeks later, they have to pack up and leave to fight the Red Army.
And the moment the tanks roll away,
The partisans just creep back out of the swamps, dig up their hidden rifles, regroup, and start blowing up the train tracks all over again.
it was a brutal war of attrition fought in the shadows. The partisans survived by bleeding, running, and hiding. They kept the German rear area command constantly anxious, constantly expending fuel and ammunition on security details, but they rarely defeated the Germans in a pitched battle.
So it's basically a stalemate.
But as we analyze this, we arrive at a critical realization about the state of the movement. By mid-1943, the partisan forces were bloodied. They were heavily suppressed by operations like Spring Clean, and they still lacked the massive, spontaneous civilian support that Soviet propaganda claimed they possessed. They were a tough, professional corps of fighters, but they were not a mass movement.
But the archives show that a tectonic shift is about to happen. As we move into the late autumn of 1943 and the winter of 1944, the movement explodes. And the reason for this explosion is deeply fascinating because it shatters another myth.
A very big myth.
This massive influx of manpower is not driven by a sudden, delayed awakening of communist ideology in the hearts of the Russian peasants. It is driven by pure, pragmatic, terrifying survival. Let's look at the raw numbers first.
The statistics from the central headquarters of the partisan movement regarding the autumn of 1943 are staggering. If we look specifically at the Leningrad Oblast, the records show that in October 1943, there were roughly 4,800 active partisans hiding in the forests.
Okay, 4,800.
By January 1944, just 90 days later, that number violently exploded to over 24,000 fighters.
Wait, 24,000?
It was a five-fold increase in manpower in 3 months. Suddenly, almost overnight, that the Senarodno that all people's war, the propaganda posters, actually materialized.
If a military force quintuples in size in 90 days, something systemic has broken. Why? What fundamentally changed in the environment between October and January?
The overarching military reality of the Eastern Front fundamentally shifted, and it trapped the civilian population in a vice. The Red Army had recovered from the early disasters and began a massive, unstoppable strategic advance westward. Consequently, the German Army Group North was forced into a desperate fighting retreat.
They're falling back.
And as the German military apparatus began to pull back, they implemented brutal, systematic scorched earth policies. They were determined to leave nothing of value for the advancing Soviets. They began systematically destroying the infrastructure. They burned villages to the ground, they poisoned wells, they destroyed crops, and they slaughtered the livestock they couldn't take with them.
But scorched earth isn't just about burning barns. It is about what they were doing to the human capital. The retreating Germans viewed the Russian civilian population as a resource to be extracted.
The human cost was the catalyst for the partisan explosion. Facing massive labor shortages back in the Reich, the retreating Germans radically ramped up the forced conscription of the local population for Ostarbeiter or Eastern worker slave labor.
That's horrifying.
German security forces would surround a village, round up the entire civilian population, particularly the young and able-bodied, pack them into train cars, and ship them back to Germany to work in weapons factories or agricultural camps under horrific conditions.
This completely changes the calculus for a civilian. In 1941, remaining neutral in your village was the safest option. Helping the partisans got you killed. But in late 1943, the German retreat means remaining neutral is no longer a viable survival strategy.
Not at all.
If you sit quietly in your farmhouse, the Germans are going to arrive, burn your farmhouse down, and put you on a train to a slave labor camp.
Going to the forest to join the partisans, which used to be the most dangerous, foolish option, suddenly became the only option for physical survival. Entire families, entire villages fled into the swamps to escape the slave roundups.
But the fear of the retreating Germans was only half of the equation, wasn't it?
Right. There is an even darker, deeply pragmatic motivation driving people into the partisan ranks. It wasn't just terror of the retreating Germans, it was terror of the advancing Soviets.
As the Red Army pushes west, every single civilian living under occupation knows that Soviet authority is returning. And returning with the Red Army is the state's security apparatus.
This is a crucial, often overlooked element of the massive recruitment spike. Right behind the regular Red Army frontline troops came SMERSH. SMERSH was the Soviet military counterintelligence agency. The name literally translates to death to spies.
That sets a tone.
As the Soviets liberated territory, Smersh detachments would immediately set up filtration camps. They would pull in every local civilian and ask one very simple, very lethal question. What exactly did you do during the 2.5 years of German occupation?
The Soviet state did not view living under occupation as a tragedy. They viewed it as inherently suspicious. If you just sat on your farm and gave a portion of your harvest to the Germans to avoid being shot, Smersh might view you as a passive collaborator.
They absolutely would.
If you worked in a German-run railway yard to get food rations, or heaven forbid, if you served in a local indigenous police unit organized by the Germans, you were dead. You were facing a firing squad or a one-way trip to the Gulag system in Siberia.
The returning Soviet state demanded proof of loyalty, and joining the partisans at the 11th hour was the most effective way, and for many, the absolutely only way to manufacture that proof.
So it was an alibi.
Exactly. If a civilian could present themselves to the advancing Red Army, wearing a red armband, carrying a rifle, and claiming they'd been fighting in the woods, it provided a political shield against Smersh interrogations.
We see the extremity of this pragmatism even with active armed collaborators.
We do.
The sources detail incredible instances of entire German-armed indigenous units defecting en masse. For example, the 437th Battalion of the ROA, the Russian Liberation Army, a collaborationist force organized by the Germans, realized the war was lost. Over 400 fully armed, trained men simply turned their weapons on their German liaisons and marched into the woods to join the partisans.
They flipped sides at the last possible moment entirely to save their own lives from the Soviet executioners.
It is a horrifying dynamic. If I try to build an analogy for this, it's not a sporting event. It is like being trapped in a massive hostage situation inside a building. The hostage takers, the Germans, realize the police are breaching, so they decide to set the entire building on fire and drag the hostages out the back door to use as slaves.
This is a good picture.
Meanwhile, the police, the Soviets, are screaming through the megaphones that if they catch any hostage who didn't actively try to stab a hostage taker, they will execute them as accomplices. The hostages aren't grabbing weapons out of heroic bravery. They are grabbing weapons because running into the crossfire is literally the only way to avoid burning to death or being executed by the rescuers.
That analogy perfectly captures the sheer terror and the complete absence of clean moral choices for the civilian population. But regardless of the pragmatic, desperate motivations of the recruits, this massive influx of manpower completely transformed the military equation on the ground.
With 24,000 fighters in the Leningrad region alone, the partisans finally had the demographic weight to execute the kind of operations Moscow had dreamed of back in 1941.
During the massive Soviet winter offensive of early 1944, the partisans evolved from a nuisance into a critical operational factor.
They aren't just creeping around blowing up single rails anymore. They have the numbers to launch coordinated, sustained assaults.
The German war diaries from this retreat phase reflect intense, chaotic frustration. The partisan attacks paralyzed operational and logistical movement. They were no longer just blowing tracks. They were felling hundreds of trees across vital retreat roads, ambushing convoys, and overwhelming rearguard garrisons.
So they were actively stopping the retreat.
We see reports of entire German combat units being stalled. For example, elements of the 12th Panzer Division were completely halted on a critical road for a significant period because partisans launched a massive, coordinated night raid on their column, destroying soft-skinned vehicles and physically blocking the escape route.
Yeah.
They systematically severed telephone and telegraph communications, forcing the retreating Germans to rely on less secure, easily intercepted radio networks. The partisans did not single-handedly cause the collapse of Army Group North. The overwhelming artillery and armor of the regular Red Army guaranteed that. But they significantly accelerated the German retreat, multiplied the chaos, and prevented the Germans from executing an orderly withdrawal.
Which brings us to the ultimate question we have to answer for this deep dive. We have traced the entire agonizing arc of this movement. We saw it begin as a catastrophic, poorly planned failure in 1941 that got thousands of unprepared bureaucrats killed.
A total failure.
We watched it struggle, bleed, and slowly professionalize through the brutal bureaucratic and military meat grinder of 1942 and 1943. And we saw it finally explode into a massive popular uprising at the very end of the war, driven mostly by a desperate civilian population trapped between German scorched earth and Soviet secret police.
A complete transformation.
Looking at the totality of that history, how does Alexander Hill ultimately assess the military effectiveness of the Soviet partisan movement?
Hill's conclusion requires us to hold two seemingly contradictory ideas in our heads at the same time. We must strip away the romantic myths, but we cannot replace them with overly cynical dismissals.
What does that mean in practice?
First, the assessment acknowledges that the Soviet post-war historical accounts vastly exaggerated both the early military success and the popular ideological nature of the movement. The idea of a unified Vsenarodno uprising in 1941 is a complete fabrication. The archives prove it.
Right.
However, just because the myth of the heroic peasant is false, it absolutely does not mean the partisan movement was a military failure. If we step back and view this from a purely macroeconomic, strategic perspective, the partisan movement was an incredibly, almost ruthlessly cost-effective weapon for the Soviet state.
The math of the Eastern Front is always grim, but let's break down the return on investment here. What did the Soviet Union actually spend to maintain this shadow war?
The state's investment was relatively minuscule when compared to the voracious appetite of the regular army. The Soviets supplied the partisans with mostly surplus or obsolete small arms, a relatively limited tonnage of explosives, a few hundred Lend-Lease radios, and a tiny fraction of the manpower compared to the millions of men fighting in the regular Red Army divisions.
They barely spent anything on them.
Furthermore, they didn't have to feed the partisans. The partisans extracted their own logistics from the local environment. Yet this relatively small, poorly supplied, structurally chaotic force managed to consistently tie down roughly 30,000 German security troops in the rear areas of Army Group North alone.
When you put it in those terms, the arithmetic is staggering. Millions of Red Army soldiers were dying in absolute meat grinder battles at the front line, whole divisions being wiped out fighting over a few hundred yards of shattered mud.
It was a bloodbath.
But meanwhile, in the forests, keeping tens of thousands of German troops busy hunting shadows, guarding bridges, and patrolling rail lines for a fraction of the cost. From the cold, calculating perspective of Joseph Stalin, that is a phenomenal strategic return on investment. Every German soldier tasked with guarding a railway bridge against partisans in the rear is a German soldier who is not manning a machine gun against the Red Army at the front.
That is the crux of the military assessment. The partisans did not single-handedly win the war on the Eastern Front. Their true, devastating operational impact was largely delayed until the chaotic German retreat in 1944.
But they still mattered.
But their constant, lingering, bleeding presence throughout 1942 and 1943 achieved something deeply strategic. It forced the German military machine to treat the entire vast rear area as hostile, contested territory. It was a war of attrition in the shadows that slowly but surely ground down German morale.
And their logistics?
It disrupted their ability to economically exploit the conquered agricultural and industrial territories, and it stretched their already fragile logistical lines to the absolute breaking point. It was an economy of force operation that yielded massive strategic dividends.
So let's look back at the journey we've taken through the archives today. We started by looking at that cinematic, romanticized myth of a spontaneous, heroic peasant uprising. And what we uncovered was something much darker, much more complex, ultimately much more human.
Far more human.
We saw a state-directed movement that was thrown into the meat grinder in 1941, virtually annihilated because of Stalin's own pre-war paranoia and purges. We watched it slowly professionalize under the shadow of a terrifying turf war between Soviet bureaucrats, fighting a bloody, desperate war of attrition against German panzer divisions.
And paying a terrible price for it.
And finally, we saw it swell into a mass movement, not out of ideological purity, but because a desperate civilian population was caught in a lethal trap between German slave labor roundups and the terrifying return of the Soviet secret police.
It is a version of history stripped of its comfortable propaganda, revealing the brutal, unvarnished mechanics of how totalitarian wars are actually fought, and more importantly, how they are experienced by the ordinary people trapped on the ground.
And that leaves us with a final, lingering thought for you to explore. As consumers of history, we love a simple narrative. We are drawn to stories of good versus evil, of oppressed people rising up in unison to fight the villain with unshakable moral clarity.
It's what we want to believe.
But when we look at the desperate civilians of Northwest Russia, the farmers who tried to stay neutral, the people who turned their own neighbors in to avoid collective punishment, the collaborators who defected, and the thousands who put on partisan armbands only when the Red Army was 5 miles away, we have to confront a deeply uncomfortable question.
What's that?
How much of what we comfortably label as heroic resistance in our historical narratives is actually just ordinary people making impossible, terrifying, pragmatic choices to simply survive being crushed between the gears of two totalitarian war machines? If you were in their shoes, freezing in the winter of 1943, watching your village burn, caught between the retreating German army and the advancing Soviet interrogators, what choice would you have made?
It is a question that removes the luxury of hindsight and strips the romance out of the cinematic image, leaving us only with the harsh, complex reality of human survival.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the archives. Keep questioning those accepted historical narratives, keep looking for the complex truth behind the comforting myths, and we'll see you next time.